Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf nun chet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to be starting with the bottom of yesterday's daf. So we saw that if an animal falls into somebody's garden and benefits, to which Rav said, what kind of benefit? We're talking about the benefit of having a soft landing, to which the Gemara said, but what? Not the benefit. Oh, and then if there's benefit, then even though the animal wasn't to blame for falling in and damaging their stuff, they do have to at least pay not the amount they damaged, but the benefit that they received, which is a smaller amount. Now, the Gemara had assumed that means, but if the animal fell and ate, they wouldn't have to pay, which seemed absurd, to which the Gemara really did say that's absurd. That can't be what Rav means. So anyway, we're now at the last word on yesterday's daf, Ela. With the way we understand what Rav said was the structure of lo mebaya kamra, which means lo mebaya achla. You don't even need to say eating. That was obvious that you're going to have to pay the mishalem imashaneh, that the owner of the animal. So let's just go through people. Ruth's animal falls into Naomi's courtyard, has a very soft land. While she falls, she ends up eating some of the crops. Of course, she's going to be liable for paying the amount that she benefited. The fact that now she doesn't need to eat lunch that day. But nechbeta ema. But if she fell and had a soft landing, you might have thought that this is no different from another case where actually she would be exempt. What would be that? So if, let's say, there's a lion in Ruth's courtyard or heading toward Ruth's courtyard, and Naomi prevents the lion from getting to Ruth's courtyard, Ruth does not have to compensate. That's called mavriach arim min nechsei chavero. If she prevents the animal from getting into and, let's say, eating the crops in Ruth's field, Ruth doesn't have to compensate Naomi for that. Why not? It's an excellent question. So, and then we'll talk about the comparison. Rashi says the reason is because, if you look here, mitzvahu, I'm in the Rashi, dibor matchil ema, okay, ema mavriach hari, okay, you might have thought, looking down in the middle of that Rashi, umitzvahi da'avad, umidi lo lishkol. Basically, Naomi's doing a mitzvah by helping Ruth. And because of that, she's doing a good deed. She doesn't get necessarily rewarded for that, or she doesn't get rewarded for it. So she doesn't get paid back. She does it of her own volition. Okay, we're going to get back to this. Isn't really an accurate comparison. We'll get to that later. This whole thing with saving someone, preventing them from having damage to their crops, it's very interesting in general why you're exempt and in what case are you exempt. So Tosfot basically says that really when we say you're not really liable, Ruth doesn't have to pay Naomi back if she prevents the lion from eating her crops, that's only if there's a chance that the lion might eat the crops, but we don't really know because she didn't really do anything because the damage wasn't definitive. But according to Tosfot, not everyone agrees with this, if the damage was definitive, 100%, the animal was about to eat it, let's say, about to put it in its mouth, and Naomi pulls the animal away, then Naomi actually will get compensated. Now, Tosfot says that, not all agree, but it's an interesting debate to think about at what point would Naomi be able to get compensation for the fact that she saved Ruth's property. But in any case, right now, we're going to say the following. In the end, Naomi's property saved Ruth's animal from getting injured. So maybe you would think it's just like Naomi blocking the lion from getting in and destroying Ruth's property. But basically they're going to say, okay, and therefore you would have thought that. That's why Rav needed to say specifically nechbeta. But right, if the animal is falling and the benefit they're getting is from the impact. But obviously the eating also, if they ate, they would obviously need to replace specifically what they benefited from. So now they're going to say the following. So let's read again. You would have thought, lo mebai, you don't even need to say with the food. Of course, if they ate, you're going to have to replace what they ate, but what they benefited from. In other words, again, the benefit, not what they ate necessarily, but the benefit they gained. But nechbeta, you might have said, maybe it's like, and then maybe you wouldn't need to pay anything. No, you at least need to pay what you benefited from. Which would be the amount that you would spend to, let's say, put a blanket down there or something like that, something that maybe costs less than the crops, but it is some sort of amount. To which they say, maybe it is like mavriach hari, and maybe you really shouldn't have to pay. So now they're going to answer. No, they're different. Okay, we thought this was the same comparison, but really it's not the same. It's true that in both cases, Naomi prevented damage from happening to Ruth's animal or property, but there's a big difference. Two differences. In the case where Naomi goes and pulls the lion back, she decided to do it of her own volition. With Raji said it was a mitzvah. She decided to do a nice thing. But when Ruth's animal falls into Naomi's courtyard and Naomi's crops get ruined, it wasn't Naomi's wish that this would happen. She didn't arrange for it to happen. So therefore, maybe in that case, therefore, you would need to compensate her. It wasn't like she said, oh, I'm going to help you. And also, and high-lab midata, right? So this wasn't midata. Inami, alternatively, another distinction is mavriach arim nechsei chavero leit pseida. Hi, eat le pseida. Another huge difference between the cases. When Naomi goes to prevent the lion from attacking, she doesn't actually have a financial loss. Now, it's true it's her time, but we all volunteer our time for certain things and we're willing to give up a few minutes to help somebody. But there's no financial loss incurred by the action. But in the case of our animal who falls in and ruins Naomi's crop, there's obviously damage there. So therefore, there's two differences, and because of that, it's not like Mavriach Ari, and that explains why, in fact, Rav thinks that you're liable if for replacing, again, paying the benefit of what you benefited, at least, from falling onto Naomi's crops. Now the Gemara asks, what type of thing caused this fall that we're going to call this onus? Rav Kahana, right, meaning unexpected behavior, right? Unexpected action, which therefore the owner's not going to be responsible for, because how could he have known to expect it? Rav Kahana Amar, we're going to have a debate between Rav Kahana and Rav, and then we're going to go back and forth between the two about who would have agreed with the other and who wouldn't agree with the other. Rav Kahana Amar, shuch lekab meimei ragleha. This is a little unpleasant. The animal urinates and then slips on the urine, falls into Naomi's garden. Rav Amar, shedachavta chaverta. It's honest when the animal right next to Ruth's animal shoves Ruth's animal to the side, and Ruth's animal falls over. Both of those are what you would call onus, but we're now going to kind of rate them. Which one's more onus than the other? If you say it's that the other animal pushed Ruth's animal, then all the more so you're going to say, if she slipped on her own urine or he slipped on his own urine, then and falls in, of course you're going to say, that's much more onus. It's very unlikely that the animal's going to urinate and then slip on the urine. What's more common? The two animals are walking next to each other and one pushes the other. That's more common and more to be expected. And we're going to learn in a minute that the owner could have theoretically done something to prevent it. Whereas with the urine, there was really nothing they could have done to prevent it. So therefore, Manda Amaru, the one who says that the onus was that the animal slipped on its urine, you could have thought that it could be that one holds, okay, which is, again, this is Rav Kahana, who said would say that if the other animal pushed it and fell over, maybe that's pasha, maybe that's pshia. Why? And then you'd have to pay even more, not just masha dehanet, but also masha yizika, all the damage you caused, that Ruth's animal now caused. Because Naomi could say to Ruth, you should have had the animals go one by one, not right next to each other. When they go right next to each other, it's very likely one could shove the other. So it was your fault, Ruth, and therefore we could theoretically might hold you responsible. And that could be what Rav Kahana would say, because they brought a more onus example. I'm a Rav Kahana, another statement of Rav Kahana here. We're going to have a few different comments here. Lo shanu ela ba'ota aruga. When we say that when Ruth's animal falls into Naomi's garden and damages the crops, right? Whether it's eating or having it, by protecting her from the impact. In the meantime, the fruits are destroyed and she has to pay damage. She doesn't have to pay damages. She just has to pay what she benefited. But now, that's only be'ota aruga. We're going to exempt Ruth from the damages, from the actual damage that was caused, as long as the animal fell in and the damage was in that same garden bed. But if the animal now goes to another garden bed nearby, and already, now this is a question here, is it time elapsing? Is it location changing, right? That already she moves to somewhere else, the animal, then already we're going to make the owner liable. but not everyone's going to agree with this. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu me'aruga la'aruga, even from one garden bed to the other. Va'afilu kol hayom kulo, even all day long. Ruth's animal falls into Naomi's courtyard. Ruth, now we're going to learn right now, Ruth doesn't have to go in and immediately remove her animal from there right away. Okay, why not? Well, we're going to now say she basically has all day, according to this. If she stays in Naomi's garden, that animal, and does damage that day, okay, then agitate seah tachzor ladat, until she goes back to Ruth's house, and then tachzor ladat means Ruth then doesn't, okay, Rashi says lo na'al b'fanei kakaway, and then Ruth doesn't lock the door properly, and then the animal goes back to Naomi's house. Then Ruth is going to be liable. But if the animal falls and spends the day there before Ruth comes and gets the animal back, then we're not going to make Ruth liable. It's a very strange thing, and it's hard to understand why. So some of the commentaries, the Meiri actually says that it's because we're worried that, or not worried, it's because Ruth is worried to go into Naomi's courtyard. Now, how often does it happen that your kids throw a ball into the neighbor's courtyard and you need to go over to the neighbor's house? And depending on who your neighbor is, sometimes you're a little bit hesitant. It's a little uncomfortable. Now, your ball's not exactly causing damage, so it's a little bit different than an animal wandering around. But still, you can imagine it's a little uncomfortable always to walk into somebody's property. So therefore, once she goes into the property, we're not necessarily holding Ruth responsible to pull that animal out, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, not everybody agrees with this, but according to Rav Kamma doesn't agree with this. But Rabbi Yochanan seems to say we give Ruth some leeway. Let the animal come out on its own. Then Ruth has to prevent the animal from coming back. I'm a Rav Papa, a third approach here. And really, Rav Papa seems to be talking about what Rabbi Yochanan said. Lo tema when Rabbi Yochanan said agite tevet tachzor ladat, until she comes back, then when Ruth knows that she's coming back, meaning Ruth didn't really protect the animal very much. Lo tema agite ladat v'tachzor ladat. It doesn't. When Rabbi Yochanan said it, he doesn't mean that Ruth has to know that the animal went back into Naomi's field in order to be liable. Ela kevan sheyatzta ladat af al pi shechadra shelo ladat. Even if, in other words, if Ruth takes the animal back in, and then, right, the animal comes out, Ruth puts the animal back in the house, locks up somewhat, okay, probably shmirat hutan, like not a huge, and then somehow the animal gets back out without Ruth knowing, she's still going to be liable. Okay, when he said tachzor ladat means comes home, and then Ruth knows about the animal, and then she basically prevents the animal from going again. But Rav Papa says, if Ruth doesn't know that the animal went back again, she's still going to be liable. And why is this? Because they're now going to say, my time, Naomi's going to say the following, and this is very common, you can imagine this. Naomi's going to say, listen, at this point, you know that your animal fell into my garden by accident. Okay, it wasn't intentional, but your animal ate in my garden. Your animal now knows that I've got good stuff in my garden. Your animal's going to want to either recreate the same scenario and fall in, and you better make sure that doesn't happen again, or the animal's going to intentionally try to break through to get out because it wants my food. So at this point, Ruth, you better watch that animal more carefully, because otherwise you're going to be held responsible for the damages. That's what Rav Papa says. So we saw kind of three approaches to at what point Ruth is going to become responsible again, right? Is it when the animal is still in there and just moves to somewhere else, and Ruth kind of has to get immediately with the program and get her animal out of there, and if she doesn't, she's liable for damages? Or she basically, right, once the animal comes back to her house, that's fine. Now she just has to make sure that she doesn't know that the animal's going back in. Or does she need to protect it more right now, higher level protection, because the animal might sneak out because they really want to go back to Naomi's garden and get the food? Now the Mishnah continues and says the following. That was all onus. The animal fell by accident. What if yarda kedarka? According to the Mishnah, if the animal goes with a typical way of going, and he's zika and damages, mishalem mashi zika. So now the owner has to pay all the damage done. That makes sense. But by Rabbi Yirmiyah loves to ask these nitpicky questions. He says, wait a minute. What if yarda kedarka, right? He's the what if guy. What if yarda kedarka? This animal goes into Naomi's field in a normal manner, right? Not by accident. But he's zika b'mei da mahu. But then the animal gives birth right there, right then and there. Okay, as she, goes over into the courtyard, gives birth. And with the birth comes a lot of amniotic fluid, and it makes a big mess all over, and it ruins the crops of Naomi. If you hold, if you hold, remember the sugya? If you start off with something bad, you shouldn't have gone in there. Rusa animal should not have gone in there. But in the end, what happened was onus, who was expecting this birth to happen. But if you say anyway that we don't care because onus is liable anyway, then lo tibayla. You're not going to even have this question. It's obvious she's going to be liable. Ruth. The question is asked, the question is asked according to the one who says, if you started off doing something negligent, but in the end, it was all an accident that happened, it wasn't due to your negligence. Now, again, here it's a little tricky. Due to your negligence, you got there, but the animal didn't really damage. The damage that happened was total onus. Would you say, or maybe it isn't, and that's the question, what do we say? Would we say, would we say, since generally you're exempt in that kind of case, you're exempt here? Oh, Dilma, or perhaps that's not the case here. Maybe Ruth is actually totally negligent here because she knew her animal was going to give birth soon. So maybe she should have watched her turning out amubet. She should have been extra careful to make sure the animal didn't go in someone else's field. And when she saw the animal went in someone else's field, she should have immediately pulled her out. So answer is teku. Like most of Rabbi Yirmiyah's questions, we don't have an answer. The Mishnah continues. Ketzad mishalem emashizika. Okay, this is the Mishnah on Nun Hamabed. If we turn there for a quick minute, the Mishnah here says, how do you pay the damage in the case where you have to pay actually what you damaged? Shamin beit seah tasadek kama itayafa v'kama hiyafa. Okay, we measure a beit seah, okay, the amount that could grow a seah of crops in that field. How much was it worth with the stuff that was damaged? And how much is it worth now that there isn't that amount that was damaged? To which the Gemara is going to say, firstly, they want to know, where do we get this from? Amar Rabbanit Damarka, ubi el b'steachil. This is the pasuk right about where we learn Shein and Regel, and it says ubi er b'steachil, and they went to someone else's sadeh field. Milamed sheshamin al gav sadeh. From here we learn that we evaluate it based on a beit seah. Okay, basically meaning we have to evaluate what this would be in a random field, not your field, not how much was this worth to you, not how much was it worth itself, not how much was it worth compared to your field. No, how much was it worth? So we're going to learn exactly. We don't even know exactly what all this means yet, but we're going to measure what it was worth, like a beit seah of that field, okay, in that field, what it was worth and what it would be worth. Like we're basically measuring it based on some sort of, again, we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to calculate this. We're going to get to that soon, but based on a random field, not necessarily this field. So now they say, hi, what do you mean? Okay, we learned at the beginning of the Masechet this halacha. Bi'er b'ste'acher comes to teach you, you're only liable for shein and regel, for the animal eating or the animal trampling something, if you're in a private domain, not a public domain. And that's what we learned, bi'er b'ste'acher. The damage is done specifically in some other field. So they say, well, we're actually going to learn two things from here, this and that. How so? It should have said, your friend's field. Why did it say acher, some other field? To explain to you that not only does it have to be in someone's field and that you're not going to be liable in the public domain, but also that we're going to assess the value of the damages based on another field. Inami, alternatively, you could say, it could have just said stay acher, not bit stay acher, in a field of someone else's. My biste acher, sheshamin al gav stay acher. Biste acher means, right, we're going to calculate it by the another field. Okay, so the bet adds two things also. In other words, we can have the stay acher, which is someone else's field, meaning not private, not public domain. And in addition, bis stay acher comes to say we evaluate it based on the value of another field. So then they say, how do you know it really comes for what we learned in the beginning of the Masechet? Maybe it's really just for this thing about how you evaluate the damage. Lafuke Rishud Rabim Minalan. And then where will we learn Rishud Rabim from? That you're not liable in Rishud Rabim. To which the Gemara says, no. We'll prove from the location of where these words appear in the Pasuk. And the Pasuk reads like this. Ki av'el ish sadeh o kerem, v'shilach ha'b'iro bi'er b'ste'acher, remember which we learned, means either the animal eats, that's the ki av'er, shilach ha'b'iro or regel, u'bi'er b'ste'acher, and it goes in some other field, meitav sadeh u'meitav karmo yishalem. So you pay with the best of your field. So now they say, if you thought it was coming to do that, just the issue of how you assess damages, well, then it should have appeared at the end of the pasuk when he was talking about the payment. If you wanted to say when we pay the damage, we assess it based on another field, it should have said you pay the best of your field or the best of your vineyard based on the assessment of a different field. But that's not where it says it. It's really at the end of the sentence. Right? And it goes with the ubi'el based on the damage done. From there, we learn it's two things. It's where the damage was done, and it connects also with the payment. So again, shmamina tarte. Now we're going to have to figure out, and this is going to take us to the end of today's daf and into tomorrow's really, which is how do we do this evaluation? We evaluate. Okay, there's basically two evaluations that have to go on. First, we evaluate, okay, how much is this compared to a seah, like X percentage, right? This, if I had a field that was a seah and the damage was done to 20% of a field that was a seah, so we have 20% of a seah as the damage. But how do we assess the field? So this is going to be, right, you figure out what a seah would be worth minus 20%, let's say. But a seah could be worth different things, depends on how big the field was. So a seah b'shishin se'in is what he says. We basically say, imagine a field with 60 seah. Okay, a seah, by the way, a beit seah is 50 cubits by 50 cubits, which is approximately 150 feet by 150 feet. Okay, in meters, it comes out to 576 square meters, a little more than half a dunam. So basically, we take a plot that size, and then we say, what would one seah, let's say someone damaged one seah out of the 60, what would that, right? How much would that decrease the value of the land? Once you put it in a much bigger section, it's already worth less, right? If you have a field that's 2 seah and 20% of your 1 seah get destroyed, that's a big percentage of your field. It's going to be kind of marked up the value. If you say we want to know what a field was that's missing 20% of 1 seah of 60 seah, already that's a much smaller value. So we're going to assess it that way. Okay? That's what Rabbi Chanina says. Rabbi Yanai Amal, Tirkav b'shishim tarkabi. Okay, this is, you don't know what Tirkav and Tarkabim are, but what it means, a Tirkav is half a seah to a Tirkav, which is, 60 Tirkavs, which is 30 seah. So this is the same 60 because it's a half of a seah to 30 se'im, which is like 1 seah to 60. So what's he saying that's any different? So basically, we're going to say the following. A field, okay, you can look at Rashi for this. Okay, Rashi says, in Tirka b'shishim tarkabim, shloshim se'in shamin, okay, v'lo shishim, you do it based on 30. Di'in kem mafsedet le'lenizak. Why? He says, it's going to be a hefsed for the nizak if you don't do this. She'ein konim etzuyim l'shishim se'im. 60 se'ah, nobody really wants to buy 60 se'ah. It's too big for the average person. And therefore, it's too much for an average person. We're going to have a whole discussion here about real estate. Okay? The average person is going to buy something that's 30 se'ah. So therefore, the 30 se'ah is going to be a higher price than 60 se'ah. In other words, per se'ah, okay, the 30 is going to actually, you're going to spend more money per se'ah in a 30 se'ah field than you are going to spend for a 60 se'ah field. So he says, we don't want the nizak, the one who was damaged, to lose out too much. Obviously, they're losing out somewhat, but we're not going to have them lose out too much. And therefore, we're going to assess it based on the 30, the same 60 ratio, because it's half a se'ah to 30, but it's based on a field that's valued at more money. Whereas the first opinion, Rabbi Chanina said, no, we're going to base it on a cheaper, because there's not a lot of demand for a 60 se'ah field. Again, the very wealthy are going to have even bigger fields. We'll get to theirs later. So those are going to be super high because they're what do you call them? Specialty items. Those go for a lot of money. Specialty field. But big fields that nobody really wants are actually going to be cheaper per seah. Okay? Now, therefore, he says that. He says, no, even more. It's going to be a stock based on the value of one stock per 60 stocks. Now, stocks already are finished products. They're not the field. That's going to be worth even more. And therefore, he says, we're going to assess it based on that. Okay? How much would this, how many klachim? And then we're going to have this higher value. So we have this debate about how exactly do we do the value? Now they bring a a difficulty. If the animal ate a kav or 2 kabim, okay, this is a much smaller amount. It's a small amount. A kav is, sorry, how does it relate to this? 1 sec, I have to remember. Forget how many kabim in a seah, but okay. But there's a bunch of kabim in a seah, okay? So now, if someone eats 1 kav or 2 kavs, the animal, you don't say pay the value of them, but you say, look at it as if it was an arugah ktana, as if they were, okay, now what this really means is they ate a kav or kabayim of stuff that was attached to the ground in your field. Because it was attached to the ground, we don't say, what is a kav, let's say, of oranges. So they ate oranges that were on your tree. You don't say, let's go to the store and say, what do those oranges cost in the store? No, you assess it as if they were growing in a garden bed. So maybe not fruits, maybe vegetables, like a bunch of cucumbers growing in a garden bed. And what would that garden bed go for? Okay, now that doesn't sound like it's being compared to a field. What is the field worth? A field of 60 seah. What if you took out 1 seah of a field of 60 seah? What would the field be worth? And then deduct, let's say, and it's going to be 20% of that because the amount they ate was 20% of the seah, let's say. Okay, so seems to saying, it's not. We say, what was the value of the garden bed that would hold X amount of cucumbers that they ate? To which they say, no, b'shishim. No, what it means is, look at it as if it was a garden bed within a seah, within 60 seah, and that would be the amount. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're going to bring a bright to that. Ein shamin kav mipnei shemashbicho v'lo beit kor mipnei shepogmo. We don't evaluate a kav because it's going to be too much, and we don't evaluate a beit kor because it's going to give him more money, and not a beit kor because it's going to give him less money. Now we don't know who this one is or that one is, and we don't know what they're talking about. And the Gemara says, "My Kamma, we don't know if you're talking about." We're going to try explaining this in one way, and then we're going to eventually explain it in a different way. So now they say, Amar Papa, Hachi Kamma. He explains, Ein shamin kav b'shishim kabim. Okay, even though it just said Ein shamin kav, what they mean is you don't do a kav in shishim kabim, mipnei shemashbiach mazik. Now this goes against what we said, according to Rav Papa's explanation. You don't evaluate a kav compared to shishim, okay, compared to 60 kabim, because you're going to end up, if you say, right, what's 60 kav going to cost minus 1? This is basically, right, just if it's not clear, this is simple buying things in bulk. The more you buy things, the less each item is going to be worth. So don't measure the kav based on what it would have been worth for 60, and if you deduct 1, because you're going to end up making the nizak, the one who got damaged, lose out, because they're not really going to get the value of what they lost. And what about the second line? The low call, right, mashbiach mazik basically means the mazik is going to win out and the nizak is going to get less money. The low call b'shishim korim mipnei shepogem mazik. And not when we evaluate a core. What's a core? We haven't seen this yet. A core is 30 seah. So a beit seah that we were talking about before times 30. Okay? Now, don't evaluate a core in 60 kolim because that's going to be pogem the mazik. Okay, now 60 kolim is already like a mansion or gargantuan amount. Okay, because imagine, right? 60 core that's huge. That's already going to be a super high price. So if you have a core's worth of damage, don't evaluate it based on 60 because you're going to make the mazik pay way too much money. Rav Huna bar Manoach says, that's very nice that you gave this explanation. It seems to make logical sense, but it certainly doesn't fit into the words of what that Braita said. Because, okay, let's just look at the words again. Ein shamin kav, it never said anything about shishim. And Lo beit core mipnesha pogmo. Now, beit core, they want to say core is core, not a beit core. A beit core is a measurement of shetach, of land. A core is a measurement of crops. So it doesn't make sense to say core means a beit core. So that's what he's going to say. Hi, velo beit core, velo core mobile. According to what you're saying, it should be kav should be compared to a core, right? Kav is a measurement and core is a measurement of volume. And the beit core is the field where it grows. But you're explaining core as a field, right? Because it's saying don't measure a core in 60 koplim, right? So you're saying this has to do with the field. Doesn't make any sense. So he explains, this is how he explains this statement. We don't assess the damages of a kav by itself, meaning what would you pay for a kav in the marketplace? Because that's going to give the nizak too much money. And again, the damage was done to the field. It's based on comparative to the field. On the other hand, lo kav bebeit core. Now, the relationship between a kav and a beit core is that a beit core has 180 kabin in it. So you can't measure a kav based on a field of a beit core, because it would diminish the value. It would be pogam nizak. It would diminish the value for the nizak. They would end up getting so little, because who cares about a teeny little kav compared to something 180 times worth what it is, 180 times the size of what it is. Ela b'shishim, but the value, like we saw before, is 60. We evaluate one kav compared to 60 times the amount of kabim, just like one seah compared to 60 seim. And that explains that bright. Hahu gavra dekatz kashba mechavre. Now we're going to have a story. There was a person who cut down somebody's palm tree. Ata the kamei de Reish Kaluta. They went before the court of the Reish Kaluta, the exilarch's court. Amar le ledidi chazeli utlata talta bikina havukaime. Vavushava meazuze. So they said, right, the court says, listen, I saw it. There were 3 trees there, and each one was altogether they were worth 100. And therefore he said, right, there were tlata bikina, there were 3 trees right there. They were all altogether worth me'azuz. Zil havle talta metalta v'tilta. So he gets 33.3, okay, 33 and a third. Basically, what's he telling him? Like what we said before, or not like what we said before? Completely not like. Because what's he saying? Evaluate it based on your field, not someone else's field, not a field the size of 60 or 30 or whatever it might be. No, it should be assessed based on this field, its value, its exact value. That's how much the person came, cut down your tree, destroyed it. They have to pay the exact value. Now, until now, that's not what we've been saying. We've been saying you have to assess what the value would have been in a big field and minus that amount in a field of 60 or 30 or whatever it might be, but not like this. So Amar, the guy says, Gabi Reish Kaluta didayin dim b'parsai lamali. I don't understand why the Reish Kaluta is doing the judgment like the Persians. Now, whether this was the Persian law or not the Persian law, what he basically is saying, this isn't Jewish law. So Amar sorry, I lost my place. So it goes before Rav Nachman, who, by the way, is usually the rabbi of the Reish Kaluta, if you remember. Amarle b'shishim. Rav Nachman rules against the court of the Reish Kaluta here and says it should be evaluated based on a field where there were 60 of these trees. Because again, right, what would it be removing one of these trees from a field of 60? That's what we keep saying. Everything is based on 60 times. Amarle Rava, what are you talking about? Now, I made it as if this is all the same, but it's not all the same. Until now, what have we been discussing? And this is what I was going to say. We've been talking about animals damaging. We weren't talking about humans damaging. We're always more strict when it comes to humans damaging. Here, a guy came into the guy's garden, chopped his tree. What's he has to pay the full damage? It's only when your animal does it, we're going to be more lenient, because someone's animal, okay, they tried to watch their animal, they didn't do a good job, but their animal damaged, so they're responsible, but we're going to make them not exactly responsible for the exact value of the damage. So Rava says we're going to distinguish, to which Amar Abai Rava, and this we're really going to only get to fully tomorrow. We're going to start it today. Abai says to Rava, I don't understand where you came up with this distinction, Nizke Gufo, Nizke Mamono. And he's going to prove it from sources that there's really no reason to distinguish here. It's going to be a little bit complicated. We'll get started and we'll see it more tomorrow. B'nizkei gufa my datech, he says. Where'd you get this from nizkei gufa? Because of the following braita, detanya, hamavkir kamosha chaveros madam. If you destroy someone's vineyard that was budding, it was just in the bud stage. So we evaluate. We take a field that would have had buds, a field full of buds. We say, how much would it be worth without this amount of buds? And we do an assessment, right? Which sounds similar to our Mishna, but not exactly, but similar. It doesn't say shishim there, but we're going to eventually say it must be they're talking about shishim because you'll see. But right now, this is about a person damaging. Then we're going to bring animal damaging. I'm going to see they use the same language. And if the animal damaging is going to be based on shishim, then the human's going to be based on shishim also because it's the exact same language. And when it means there, it must be in the same thing here. And then we're going to basically say by humans it's shishim also. And that's going to be a big question on this court of Reish Galuta. We're going to be left with, why did the Reish Galuta's court rule that way? Okay, that's basically where we're going. I'm kind of telling you the punchline because we're not going to actually finish the whole thing today. So now they say, so now it says we assessed how much the field was with that tree and how much the field is without that, or without the buds, right? Without the part that was damaged, and how much it is with it, and that's the damage. Ve'ilu b'shishim lo katani, but it doesn't say anything about shishim here. Now you want to say based on that, when a human does damage, there's no shishim because look at this braita. But that doesn't work because atu gabe behemto nami milo tanya ki agavna, but wait. The braita by animals says the exact same thing, exact same language. Titania. Now it's going to be a long braita. We're going to see most of it more tomorrow. But katma nitia. Okay, an animal breaks someone's sapling. Rabbi Yossi Omer goes like Zerop Yerushalayim. Okay, the people who instituted takanot in Jerusalem. Omrim nitia bat shnata shte kesef bat shte shanim arba'a kesef. They gave a particular value to it. Okay, that's not what we've seen until now. They said, a small one was worth this, depending on how old it was worth this or more, older was worth that. Achlach chaziz, if they ate, now that was something that was already grown. If it wasn't yet grown and it was really more like, grass growing that the animals eat, animal fodder. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, nidon b'mishuyal shebo. Okay, what does that mean? Well, right now it hasn't grown. We wait until the season where it grows. And then we say, X amount grew to Y amount. So the amount that was damaged would have been worth this had it grown. Now, by the way, this is interesting because let's say the crop failed that year. You would actually get paid nothing. If the crop was amazing that year, you get paid a lot. So he has this unique opinion that we haven't seen yet, that we wait until it actually grows to see. No, the rabbis say, like we saw before, we assess it based on its value right now. What would it feel like this? The stuff is just growing, but okay, it still has a value in the market. What would people sell for, buy? What would people pay for the whole thing? Minus what would they pay for it without, right? The amount that they could now sell it, now that it doesn't have that part that was damaged. Okay, the Bright is going to continue into tomorrow's stuff. We'll stop here, but what they're going to end up saying, like I said, I already kind of gave you the punchline, which is, if by animals and by people damaging, it says the exact same thing. And it must be based on what we learned before. When it says we assess it, it must be based on a field the size of shishim, even though it doesn't say so. And then it would be the same for the people. And then basically go back to Rava and say, I don't know where you got this idea that when people damage, it's not going to be 30, and it really should be. Like Rav Nachman said, which is we're going to assess it based on 60. Okay, we're going to assess it based on 60. So what did we see today as a review of the daf? We started with the animal falling into the garden accidentally. We talked about, right, why you had to point out this unique thing. Yes, even if they eat, they're going to have to pay what they enjoyed. Also, if they fell and had a soft landing, it's not like Mavriach Hari. We gave two distinctions. Why? Then we got into at what point is the animal not liable anymore for damages? Immediately if they go into a different garden bed, or the whole time they're still in that garden before they leave the garden, right? What's the responsibility of the owner after they leave the garden? Do they have to put up more barriers because there's a concern the animal will go back there to eat? So we saw a bunch of different opinions. Then we talked about the case of the animal falls in, and then they give birth and the amniotic fluid goes all over the place and damages. Is that going to be liable or not liable? Do we call that or not? Is it maybe not onus because the owner knew the animal was pregnant? Then we went to how do we do this payment? And for that, we started seeing all these different measurements of based on what size field we assess, because there's all different size fields are worth different amounts per seah or per kav, right? So then it was a matter of, is it, and then we saw a huge field is worth a ton more money. The smaller, but yet still big, is actually worth less money because there's no demand for that size field. And then the smaller, get a little smaller, and then you get to, oh, well, that's an average size field. That's going to actually, there's a lot of demand for it. Price can be kind of high. So we had this whole thing about, which one we use for the price. In the end, it seems the majority opinion is the shishim, the 60 times the amount. And then again, 60 times the amount could be in a field of 30 or based on a field of 60, right? Half to 30 or whole one to 60. We saw different opinions about that. And then we got to this case with the Reish Galuta where they didn't do that. And then the question is, why didn't they evaluate it that way? Is there a distinction between humans who damage or animals who damage? It seems like the sugya is going to tell us there really shouldn't be a distinction, and we don't really know why the Reish Galuta ruled that way. With that, we'll finish for today's daf. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom.